There are some of you listening now that will already know a little about the Cerne Abbas giant, the imposing chalk figure wielding a club and an erect phallus that's carved into the hillside above the eponymous village in West Dorset. Some of you may have heard that it's a representation of the hero Hercules or the Celtic god Cernunnos, but the truth is even stranger still, for the figure it represents has no name, at least none remembered by humankind. Fact is, the Cerne giant has existed in one form or another since the first folk settled here, and it will remain in place until the very last leave. First it was a crude carving, then some time after it was a corn dolly. For a while it was a simple drawing on a shard of exposed rock. Soon enough, though, it became the figure that graces the hillside today, rampant and imposing. Despite its many forms, though, it's only ever had one role, and only ever demanded one price for its services. Although we tend to take our food for granted nowadays, knowing full well that we can pay a visit to any number of supermarkets any time the fancy takes us, there was a time not long ago when starvation lurked inside the shadow of every failed harvest. Back then it wasn't so much your talent or your skill or how hard you work that determined whether or not your belly stayed full. Instead, it was the vagaries of the weather, the idiosyncrasies of the seasons, and the whims of forces beyond the control of mere mortals that decided whether you'd survive or starve. However, despite the fact that these things exist beyond the remit of humankind, they are not beyond the spheres that other beings can influence, beings such as the Cerne giant. It's well accepted that the giant is a figure of fertility, but you see, fertility is not just something that makes crops grow or flocks expand. Rather, it's the spark of life itself, the implacable potency that allows all things to thrive, that injects vibrancy and spirit into all things. A fertile land leads not just to fertile men and fertile women, but fertile minds and fertile spirits. Without it, there can be no love or joy or life in any meaningful form. So, those beings that can bring this spark to bear and direct it according to their wishes can cause life to thrive where it may otherwise dwindle. However, they don't bestow their gifts for free. After all, everything has a price, and what price is more suitable for life's own spark than the modest gift of life in return? And what lives are considered most precious to us all? This equation may sound callous to modern ears, but do we not practice this exchange in our own way? How many young lives have been sacrificed on the battlefields of history for land or wealth or religion or belief? How many young lives given so that others may live in safety and security? At least when you enter into a bargain with a being such as the Cerne giant, the terms are clear. There's no wanton wastage, just a simple, well-defined quid pro quo. Life, bounty, prosperity and success for a whole community, all in exchange for one child once a year. No one knows who originally struck the bargain, but it was made well before England earned its name or the Celtic peoples settled here, well before the mammoths died out and after the ice receded. There have, of course, been times when the populace has forgotten its tribute, or rejected the arrangement in fits of self-righteous fury. The offerings always resume, though, for when the agreement is not honoured, the fertile land soon turns barren. Livestock begin to collapse in the fields, and babes begin to perish in their mothers' bellies. Without that fertile spark, all life, all joy, everything that motivates and drives us, simply ceases. The populace turn ashen and their souls begin to starve, famished by the absence of a fertile spirit. So, before long, whatever their objections or moral protestations, sooner or later they all gather within the trendle, a rectangular earthwork built directly above the giant's head, holding flickering torches and repeating the old words. Outsiders, of course, know little of this, but there was a man named Tom Lethbridge who once saw more than he was prepared for and was haunted for the rest of his days. He came down to the area in 1957 along with 3 members of the Society of Antiquaries and his lecturer in anthropology, ostensibly to study the Beltane rituals that had survived into the modern era in some of the quieter corners of the Dorset countryside. Being the festival of spring and a celebration of all the optimism that comes with new life, Beltane, or May Day as it's known today, has long been reserved for all manner of fertility rites. So, It's only fitting that it's on this night that the villagers of Cerne Abbas have always gathered to feed the spring. It was also the night that Tom Lethbridge and his companions chose to camp out upon the Giant's Hill to observe and record the number of balefires that dotted the surrounding countryside. They were engaged in this task when they first noticed the long meandering serpent of torchlight winding itself up towards the Giant's head. Thinking that they were about to witness nothing more than some long-forgotten Beltane ritual, they secreted themselves behind a thicket of gorse and withdrew their notebooks in anticipation. As soon as the procession reached the trendle, its participants splayed out, not in a circle but in the form of an 8-pointed star resembling a scrolling of the sun. There they began to play the most divine and cheerful music on a collection of flutes and lyres and fiddles. As the song progressed, the youngest among them began to skip between the celebrants, scattering brightly coloured flower petals as they went. In all its merriment it resembled any other May Day gathering. But when the cheerfulness that infected the affair reached its zenith, a family was brought forth. A mother, a father, and a beautiful rosy-cheeked girl no older than 6 or 7. Crowns of dried flowers were placed on their heads, while even more petals were scattered at their feet, and twists of corn were placed around their wrists and ankles. Once adorned, they climbed a mound in the centre of the trendle, where the girl sat between her mother's legs and received her final warm embrace. Soon after, the father was handed a silver sickle, its viciously keen blade glinting in the light from the fires. In unison, then, the assembled mass began repeating the old words so old they belonged to no surviving language, so ancient no one could honestly say they knew their true meaning, but words that were none the less said in thanks. As those words flew from their mouths, they resonated and hummed, turning the air around them from a free-flowing gas to an aerosol heaving with anticipation. As they were repeated, the petals that had once covered the ground began to shiver and twist and rise and swirl, as if caught in the eddies of an invisible pool. Then, as they rose and circulated throughout the thick, soupy air, the father placed the scythe around his daughter's neck, and at that moment Tom Lethbridge and his companions leapt forth from their hiding place, screaming demands to let the girl go. The man to his right, having served in Korea, even produced a revolver from his jacket and pointed it at the father, threatening to shoot him dead if he did not desist. The villagers, though, they simply stood. Implacable, unyielding, and intransigent, they stood and stared expectantly towards the gorse bush that now lay behind the interlopers. What the villagers could see, but they could not, was the bush begin to stand and unravel, unpeeling its branches into thorny tendrils that spat out and seized the men. Once they had a good hold of the trespassers, they began forcing themselves into every open hole they could find, and piercing each organ as they felt their way along, inch by inch, through writhing, tortured flesh. The only one to escape was Tom Lethbridge himself, who was standing just far enough away to see the first of his compatriots brought down and heed it as a warning. As soon as the strangers had been dispatched, the ceremony continued until it reached its final, inevitable conclusion, and was thereafter laid to rest for another year. After all, there was no way that the being who had held dominion there for eons was going to allow its feast to be interrupted by 4 transient and perishable souls. Tom Lethbridge shared what he had seen, of course, otherwise I wouldn't know to tell you this tale now, but no one of position or merit believed him. So soon enough he was branded a lunatic and locked away in the Dorset County Asylum for his own protection. If you like, you can choose to believe the same thing the doctors at Harrison Hospital did, that Mr. Lethbridge lost control of his senses and mistook some innocent country custom for a profane ceremony before viciously attacking his companions. You can choose to believe that the Cerne giant is nothing more than an inert earthwork, a remnant of a past long forgotten. Of course, if I were you, I'd still stay away from Cerne Abbas come May Day. After all, it's better to be safer than sorry, and there's no telling what you might see.